Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Parth Bapat and I am a visiting faculty at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. In today's module, Ecosystems, which is from the paper Environment and Society, I will be essentially talking to you about various attributes of an ecosystem and how to some extent humans have modified ecosystems. As we saw last time in the last lecture, no animal lives in isolations. They are always interacting with each other and they are also interacting with their surroundings, what we call their environment. So they interact with biotic as well as abiotic factors. The details of these relationships vary from place to place. In all cases, however, the interactions of the various organisms under natural circumstances have two consequences. One, a flow of energy through autotrophs to heterotrophs, and two, a cycling of inorganic materials which move from the abiotic, that is non-living environment, through the biotic environment, that is through the bodies of these organisms, and back to the environment, abiotic environment. Now, such a combination of living and non-living elements through which energy flows and materials recycle is known as an ecosystem. From a large perspective, the entire biosphere can be looked at as an ecosystem. Such a view sometimes is very useful when studying materials that are recycled on a larger worldwide scale, such as carbon dioxide, oxygen, water, etc. On the other hand, a suitably stocked aquarium or a terrarium is also an ecosystem. Such human-made model ecosystems prove very useful in studying certain ecological problems, such as detailed pathways of a particular recycling material, etc. Most ecosystem studies are made on more or less self-contained natural ecosystems, such as ponds, swamps, or meadows. So when we are looking at an ecosystem, any natural ecosystem, we have to start, of course, with the source of energy for that ecosystem. I'm sure you will understand that the ultimate source of energy for all ecosystems is the sun. Of the solar energy that reaches the earth, some is dissipated in evaporation of water. Most of it is absorbed into the surface layers of the earth and radiated back in the form of heat. Only a very small fraction of the total available energy from the sun enters the bodies of organisms and fuels their life processes. Even if sunlight falls on dense vegetation such as a thick forest, a planted field, or a marsh, only 1 to 2% of it gets involved in photosynthesis. The photosynthetic process, using carbon, oxygen, water, and a few minerals, sequesters the energy in this little fraction of sunlight to produce organic materials like carbohydrates. Thus, the light energy of sunlight is converted by autotrophs into the chemical energy of various organic compounds, which act as a secondary source of energy for heterotrophs. Both autotrophs and heterotrophs use part of the energy sequestered or consumed by them to carry out their various life processes. It is only the remainder of the energy that gets stored in an organism's body and is therefore available to some organisms consuming it as food. Usually, an organism itself uses about 90% of the energy sequestered and consumed by it. only about 10% gets stored in its body. Now we have looked at the ultimate source of energy, the sun, and how much of it actually reaches the biotic world. After this, it will be interesting to see how this energy flows through the biotic world. The pathway along which the sequestered energy passes from one organism to another is called a food chain. Each organism in a given food chain represents a given trophic level, meaning feeding level. The first trophic level of a food chain is always occupied by some or the other autotroph. It is referred to as the primary producer of the food chain. Examples of primary producers are green plants like mosses, ferns, grasses, trees, as well as many usually water-dwelling unicellular and multicellular photosynthetic organisms. We tend to forget this fact that a lot of photosynthesis takes place in water. The remaining level of food chain are occupied by different kinds of heterotrophs. The second trophic level in the food chain would be occupied by a herbivore. You remember the definition of herbivore from our last session. It is referred to as the primary consumer. It is through the primary consumer that energy enters the world of heterotrophs. Examples of primary consumers include caterpillars, leaf ants, field mice, sparrows, elephants, and a blue whale. Occupied by a carnivore, a heterotroph that feeds on the one occupying the second trophic level. It is referred to as the secondary consumer of the food chain. For example, spiders, minnows, snakes, robins, lions. Some food chains have third and fourth consumer level too, but 5 levels are usually the limit. This is largely because of the inevitable waste of energy that occurs as it transferred from one trophic level to another. In other words, of the energy collectively sequestered by the primary producers of an ecosystem, 1/10 becomes available to the primary consumers, 100 to its secondary consumers, and 1000 to its tertiary consumers, and decreasing proportionately as it moves to even higher trophic levels. Thus, beyond the fifth trophic level, there is usually too little energy left available to support any further levels. Food chains that start with autotrophs are called grazing food chains. Some organisms, as we have discussed earlier, feed on detritus. Now, detritus feeders are in turn fed upon by other organisms. Such food chains that start with detritus feeders or detritus are referred to as detritus food chains. In nature, feeding relationships rarely take the form of a simple chain, with organisms feeding on and being fed upon by more than one species, as well as a given species sometimes occupying different trophic levels at different times. These relationships often take the form of a complex food web. A large group of consumers derive energy from decaying material, which is too decomposed to be eaten by other consumers, but not decomposed enough to serve as nutrients for producers. This unique group of consumers, mainly comprising bacteria and fungi, are referred to by a range of technical terms such as detrivores, saprotrophs, and chemoheterotrophs, but they are most popularly called as decomposers. a term that probably best describes their ecological role. The effect of the decomposer's activities is to release the matter trapped in the wastes of the living world, making it available once more to producers and through them to the rest of the living world. We looked at the qualitative relationship between various organisms as far as their feeding habits were concerned. Now let's look at a slightly more quantitative approach of studying them. Diagram representing the quantitative relationship among the trophic levels in an ecosystem is called as an ecological pyramid. An ecological pyramid may be a pyramid of numbers, showing the number of individuals occupying each trophic level. Similarly, there can be a pyramid of biomass, showing the collective dry weight of all the individuals at each trophic level, or a pyramid of energy, showing the energy available at each trophic level. It must be noted that ecological pyramids need not necessarily be pyramidal in shape. For example, if the primary producer of an ecosystem is a large tree which supports a number of primary consumers, which in turn support a proportionately smaller number of secondary consumers, a pyramid of numbers representing this ecosystem would have a very small base that broadens out widely and then narrows again towards the top. Similarly, a pyramid of biomass representing an ocean ecosystem is invariably an inverted pyramid. This is because at any given time, the vast number of tiny plankton species represent a smaller biomass than that of the zooplankton or the even larger heterotrophic organism such as the blue whale that they support. The rapid rate of reproduction of the primary producers in question as compared to that of their consumers makes this possible. Only pyramids of energy are inevitably pyramidal, with available energy unfailingly decreasing at each successive trophic level. So far we were looking at energy and how it flows through an ecosystem. Now let's look at how nutrients move through this biotic world. Unlike energy, which takes a one-way path through an ecosystem, many organic materials like water, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus cycle through ecosystems. Of these, water and different gases tend to circulate on a worldwide basis. Non-gaseous nutrients, on the other hand, tend to circulate more or less within ecosystems, and a stable ecosystem tends to be self-sufficient in the supply of such components. These movements of inorganic materials from the geological components to ecosystems like atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere through their biological components and back again in the form of various chemicals are referred to as biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycles are named on the basis of the chief element being circulated. Thus, the process by which nitrogen is circulated continuously through the living world is called the nitrogen cycle. So far we have looked at the ecosystems, the energy source of an ecosystem, the food chain, the food web, and various pyramids associated with an ecosystem, numbers as well as biomass and energy. Further, we looked at biogeochemical cycles. Now it's time to move on to another aspect of the living world, which is called as communities and succession. The different organisms living in a particular area make up an ecological community. Within an ecological community, all the individuals of one species constitute a population. Thus, an ecological community is composed of different constituent populations. The composition of an ecological community is determined by a variety of factors. Some of these factors are physical, such as the temperature, the rainfall, or the soil type of the area. Other factors are biological, such as the various interactions between the individuals of the populations making up the community. An ecological community is rarely constant. Instead, one community gets steadily replaced by another. This process of community change is called ecological succession. The process usually takes place in an orderly and somewhat predictable sequence. The occupation of a lifeless area by an ecological community is called primary succession. It may be observed on a bare site, such as one produced by volcanic action or glaciation or a newly formed riverbank. The process usually starts with the weathering of the rocks to form soil. If physical conditions such as light, temperature, and moisture permit it, this soil gets occupied by increasingly complex organisms. The species that are the first organisms to colonize a lifeless area are called pioneer species. The presence of these pioneer species modifies the environment of the area, making it possible for other species to either join or replace the original colonizers. Though this change in the species profile of the community is rapid in the initial stages, it eventually slows down to an almost imperceptible rate. The community formed at each stage of the succession process is called a seer. The final stage reached is called a climax community. Succession initiated by the disruption of a previously existing seral or climax community is called secondary succession. It may be observed at the site of a forest fire or on removal of grazing pressure on a pasture land or once we stop cultivation in a field. Whether succession is primary or secondary, the climax community will be the same in a given area. This is because the nature of the climax community is determined by the physical conditions of the area, such as temperature, rainfall, and soil type. In areas where these factors are relatively unfavorable to life, ecological succession consists of relatively fewer stages, and the resulting climax community is relatively simple. In areas where these factors are relatively less limiting, the climax community is relatively complex and diverse. The various stages of ecological succession differ from ecosystem to ecosystem as regards the rate of change and the particular species involved. However, all ecosystems show certain common results as they progress towards the climax stage. Firstly, there is always an increase in the biomass of the ecosystem. Secondly, there is an increase in the number of species constituting the community. This increase in species number inevitably has certain important consequences. One is a greater stratification of primary producers, leading to greater utilization of the different wavelengths of available sunlight. The other is a greater complexity of food webs, leading to greater resilience in the event of any environmental fluctuations. The greater the biomass production and biological diversity of an ecosystem, the more mature it is considered to be. Thus, ecological succession takes an ecosystem from a relatively immature state to a mature state. Now, we look at some classification of these various ecosystems. Very broadly speaking, there are two ways of categorizing or classifying these ecosystems. One, which is based on land, a terrestrial ecosystem, and two, one which is based on water, the aquatic ecosystem. The main factor which differentiates terrestrial ecosystems from aquatic ones is the difference in availability of water. Thus, terrestrial ecosystems are characterized by shortage of water, while aquatic ecosystems are characterized by surplus of water. Terrestrial ecosystems also usually experience greater temperature fluctuations over the course of a day as well as over the course of a year as compared to aquatic ecosystems in similar climates. Terrestrial ecosystems have access to more light than aquatic ecosystems because light travels more easily through air than through water. Terrestrial ecosystems also have easier access to gases like carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen compared to aquatic ecosystems, where they need to first dissolve in the water in order to become available to aquatic organisms. Let's now look at very broadly the different types of ecosystems that fall under these two headings of aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. In terrestrial ecosystems, the relatively lower availability of water makes water an important limiting factor. The main types of terrestrial ecosystems are forests, grasslands, and deserts. Forest ecosystems have a high number of trees. The different types of forest ecosystems include tropical evergreen forest, tropical deciduous forest, temperate evergreen forests, temperate deciduous forests, etc. If you look at desert ecosystems, they are located in the regions which receive an annual rainfall of less than 25 centimeters. The vegetation of such regions comprises shrubs, bushes, a few grasses, and only a very small number of trees. The last significantly large ecosystem in terrestrial ecosystems is the grassland ecosystem. Grasslands are areas in which the natural vegetation consists mainly of grasses with only a very small number of shrubs and trees. Now let's come to the aquatic ecosystems. Aquatic ecosystems can be broadly divided into two basic categories: marine ecosystems, that is aquatic ecosystems based in salt water, and freshwater ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems based in the sweet water. In aquatic ecosystems, it is either light or nutrients which can become the most important limiting factor. Light does not penetrate beyond roughly 200 meters in water. So light is the most important limiting factor in the deeper waters of marine ecosystems such as seas and oceans. On the other hand, most of the nutrients on which aquatic organisms depend arrive with the runoff from land and settle on the floor of the water body. So the farther one goes from land, either horizontally or vertically, into an ecosystem, nutrients become the most important limiting factor. Important feature of the marine ecosystem of this planet is their connectivity, which technically unites them into one vast ecosystem. Another interesting feature is their predominance on this planet, with marine ecosystems covering around 71% of Earth's surface and collectively containing almost around 97% of the total water present on Earth. Freshwater ecosystems are very small in magnitude as compared to marine ecosystems. There are three basic kinds of freshwater ecosystem. Lentic ecosystems based in slow moving or still freshwater as found in ponds or lakes. Lotic ecosystems based in fast moving water as found in streams and rivers, and wetlands based in shallow waters where soil remains regularly saturated with water on a day-to-day basis. So today, so far, we have looked at ecosystems, the various components of an ecosystem, functioning in terms of energy flow and nutrient circulation of an ecosystem. We have also looked at pyramids, webs, chains. We have looked at succession, and then we have looked at different types of ecosystems. If you need further information, please go through our text and suggested further readings given at the end of the text. Thank you very much.